The Salem witch trials stand as a dark testament to the destructive power of fear and superstition in human history. This pivotal event in the 17th century America exposed the deadly consequences of unchecked hysteria and false accusations. In the late 17th century, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a bastion of Puritan values, where the harsh realities of life in the New World had fostered a community bound together by shared struggles and strict religious doctrine. The colony's economy was primarily based on agriculture, with many residents relying on the land for their livelihood. However, the soil was poor and the climate was unforgiving, making every harvest a hard-won victory. It was amidst this backdrop of hardship and uncertainty that the seeds of fear and superstition would take root. The year was 1692, and the colony was still reeling from the aftermath of King William's War, which had ended just 3 years prior. The conflict had brought significant economic hardship, as well as a surge in refugee populations fleeing the war-torn frontier areas. This influx of new residents put a strain on the already limited resources of the colony, exacerbating existing social and economic tensions. In the small village of Salem, located about 16 miles north of Boston, these tensions were particularly pronounced. The village was divided into two distinct communities: Salem Town, which was a thriving commercial center, and Salem Village, a more rural and impoverished area. The villagers of Salem Village felt increasingly disenfranchised and marginalized by the more affluent residents of Salem Town, who seemed to hold greater sway over the colony's government and economy. It was within this context of economic hardship, social unrest, and deep-seated fears that a group of young girls, including Abigail Williams, Betty Paris, and Ann Putnam, began exhibiting strange and disturbing behaviors. They would convulse, scream, and contort their bodies in ways that seemed inexplicable to the villagers. The girls claimed that they were being tormented by witches who were afflicting them with evil spells and malevolent spirits. The girls' behavior was not entirely new. There had been previous instances of similar afflictions in the colony, often attributed to witchcraft or demonic possession. However, the sheer number of affected individuals and the intensity of their symptoms set this episode apart from earlier occurrences. As news of the afflicted girls spread, it sparked a wave of fear and anxiety that would soon engulf the entire community. Reverend Samuel Parris, the uncle and guardian of Abigail Williams and Betty Paris, played a significant role in fueling the growing hysteria. He was a staunch Puritan who believed in the reality of witchcraft and the existence of evil spirits. Paris saw the girls' afflictions as evidence of a satanic plot to destroy the colony, and he began to preach sermons warning of the dangers of witchcraft and the need for vigilance against the forces of darkness. As the villagers became increasingly convinced that witchcraft was indeed at work in their midst, they began to look for scapegoats. The first to be accused was Tituba, a slave from Barbados who worked in the household of Reverend Paris. Tituba was known for her knowledge of folk remedies and her practice of fortune-telling, which made her an easy target for accusations of witchcraft. The accusation against Tituba marked the beginning of a chain reaction that would ultimately lead to the downfall of many innocent people. The villagers' fear and superstition had created a perfect storm, in which the boundaries between reality and fantasy became increasingly blurred. As the days passed, more and more individuals would be accused of witchcraft, setting in motion a tragic sequence of events that would leave an indelible mark on American history. The accusations against Tituba and other initial targets, such as Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, were often based on flimsy evidence and hearsay. However, the atmosphere of fear and hysteria had become so pervasive that even the most dubious claims were taken as gospel truth. The villagers' desire for explanations and their need for scapegoats led them to embrace a simplistic narrative in which the forces of evil were embodied by witches and other malevolent agents. As the witch hunt gained momentum, it would attract the attention of prominent figures, including William Stoughton, the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and Cotton Mather, a respected Puritan minister. These individuals would play significant roles in shaping the course of events, often with devastating consequences for those accused of witchcraft. As the witch hunt gained momentum, Cotton Mather's influence became increasingly significant. His book, Memorable Providences, relating to witchcrafts and possessions, published in 1689, had already contributed to the colony's fascination with witchcraft. Mather's writings emphasize the reality of demonic possession and the need for vigilance against Satan's minions. He saw the events unfolding in Salem as a clear manifestation of the spiritual battle between good and evil. In February 1692, Mather delivered a sermon at the Boston North Church in which he warned his congregation about the dangers of witchcraft and the importance of rooting out the devil's agents. William Stoughton, the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, also played a pivotal role in shaping the course of events. As the colony's highest-ranking judicial officer, Stoughton was instrumental in establishing the Court of Oyer and Terminer, a special tribunal tasked with trying the witchcraft cases. The court's first session was held on June 2, 1692, in Salem town, with Stoughton presiding as Chief Justice. The court's proceedings were marked by a lack of due process and the admission of dubious evidence, including spectral evidence, testimony about dreams and visions. This type of evidence was considered valid by the court, despite its questionable reliability. The first person to be tried by the Court of Oyer and Terminer was Bridget Bishop, a wealthy widow who owned a local tavern. Bishop had a reputation for being outspoken and contentious, which may have contributed to her being targeted. The prosecution's case against her relied heavily on spectral evidence and testimony from several afflicted girls, including Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis. On June 2, 1692, the court found Bishop guilty of witchcraft, and she was sentenced to death by hanging. Her execution took place on June 10, 1692, in Salem town, marking the first of many tragic events that would unfold over the coming months. As the summer of 1692 wore on, the pace of trials and executions accelerated. The court's zeal for convictions was fueled by the fervor of the community, which saw the witch hunt as a necessary measure to protect itself from Satan's influence. In July 1692, 5 more people were executed: Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Sarah Wilds, and William Hobbs. The executions took place on July 19, 1692, in Salem town, with large crowds gathering to witness the hangings. The atmosphere was tense and emotional, with many spectators believing that they were witnessing the triumph of good over evil. The court's proceedings continued throughout the summer, with more trials and convictions taking place. In August 1692, 19 people were executed, including John Proctor, a farmer who had spoken out against the witch hunt. Proctor's execution was particularly notable, as he had been a vocal critic of the court's methods and had questioned the validity of the spectral evidence being used against the accused. His death served as a warning to others who might dare to challenge the authority of the Court of Oyer and Terminer. As the summer of 1692 drew to a close, the Court of Oyer and Terminer continued its relentless pursuit of witches, with the number of executions showing no signs of abating. In September 1692, 17 more people were put to death, including Margaret Scott, a widow from Rowley, and Wilmot Red, an elderly woman from Marblehead. The executions took place on September 22, 1692, in Salem town, with the usual crowd of spectators gathering to witness the hangings. However, there were also signs of growing unease among some members of the community who began to question the validity of the spectral evidence being used to convict the accused. One such skeptic was Robert Pike, a respected member of the community and a former deputy to the Massachusetts General Court. Pike had been a vocal critic of the court's methods from the outset, and he continued to speak out against the use of dubious evidence in the trials. His views were shared by other prominent figures, including Samuel Sewall, a Boston merchant and member of the governor's council, who began to express doubts about the wisdom of the witch hunt. Despite these growing reservations, the Court of Oyer and Terminer remained committed to its course, with Chief Justice William Stoughton continuing to preside over the trials. In October 1692, the court tried and convicted several more people, including Mary Easty, a sister of Rebecca Nurse, who had been executed earlier in the summer. Easty's trial was notable for the fact that she was able to produce a number of character witnesses who testified to her good reputation and pious behavior, but these testimonies were ultimately disregarded by the court. As the autumn of 1692 wore on, the witch hunt began to spread beyond Salem village, with accusations being made in other communities throughout Essex County. In the town of Andover, a group of girls began to exhibit symptoms similar to those experienced by the afflicted girls in Salem. And soon, accusations were flying, with several people being arrested and brought before the court of Oyer and Terminer. The court's zeal for convictions showed no signs of abating, and it seemed likely that the witch hunt would continue unabated into the winter months. In November 1692, the Massachusetts General Court met to consider the crisis unfolding in Salem, with many members expressing concerns about the conduct of the trials and the use of spectral evidence. The court ultimately decided to dissolve the court of Oyer and Terminer and establish a new court to oversee the remaining cases. But this decision did little to halt the momentum of the witch hunt, which continued to claim victims into the winter of 1692–93. As the winter of 1692–93 set in, the new court established by the Massachusetts General Court began to hear the remaining cases with a significant shift in approach. The court, now known as the Superior Court of Judicature, was composed of judges who were more skeptical of the spectral evidence that had been used to convict so many people. One of the first cases to be heard was that of Mary Lacey, a 17-year-old girl from Andover who had been accused of witchcraft by several of her peers. However, when the court examined the evidence against her, they found it to be lacking, and she was ultimately acquitted. This acquittal marked a turning point in the trials, as the court began to apply a more rigorous standard of evidence to the cases before it. In January 1693, the court heard the case of Rebecca Nurse's sister, Mary Easty, who had been convicted by the court of Oyer and Terminer in October 1692. However, upon reviewing her case, the Superior Court of Judicature found that the evidence against her was insufficient, and she was released from prison. As the weeks went by, more and more people who had been accused of witchcraft were brought before the court, only to be acquitted due to lack of evidence. The court's newfound skepticism was fueled in part by the efforts of Robert Pike and Samuel Sowell, who continued to speak out against the use of dubious evidence in the trials. In February 1693, Sowell took a bold step by publicly apologizing for his role in the execution of several people who had been accused of witchcraft. In March 1693, a group of Boston merchants, including Samuel Sewall, published a pamphlet criticizing the use of spectral evidence in the trials and calling for a more nuanced approach to the issue of witchcraft. As the spring of 1693 approached, the Superior Court of Judicature continued to hear cases with a focus on ensuring that justice was served. In May 1693, the court heard the case of Elizabeth Johnson, a woman from Andover who had been accused of witchcraft by several of her neighbors. However, after examining the evidence against her, the court found it to be lacking, and she was acquitted. By the summer of 1693, the witch trials had largely come to an end, with most of those who had been accused either acquitted or released from prison. In August 1693, the Massachusetts General Court passed a bill that provided for the restitution of damages to those who had been wrongly accused and imprisoned during the trials. In 1695, the Massachusetts General Court officially declared that the trials were unlawful and offered restitution to the victims' families. In 1706, Ann Putnam, one of the main accusers during the trials, publicly apologized for her role in the executions. The apology was a significant step towards healing the wounds of the community, which had been deeply divided by the trials. In 1708, the Massachusetts General Court passed a resolution that declared the witch trials to be a grave injustice and provided for further restitution to the victims' families. This resolution marked a formal acknowledgement by the government of the wrongdoing that had occurred during the trials, and it paved the way for the community to begin the process of healing and reconciliation. The legacy of the Salem witch trials continued to shape the community in the years and decades that followed. In 1957, the state of Massachusetts formally apologized for the executions and established a memorial to the victims in Danvers, formerly known as Salem Village. The memorial, which features a park and a monument, serves as a reminder of the dangers of mass hysteria and false accusations. The Salem witch trials also had a profound impact on the development of American law, particularly with regards to the use of spectral evidence in criminal trials. In the years that followed, the courts began to place greater emphasis on empirical evidence and to approach cases involving supernatural claims with a healthy dose of skepticism. This shift in approach helped to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future and ensured that the principles of justice and due process were upheld. The aftermath of the Salem witch trials also saw a significant decline in the number of witchcraft accusations and prosecutions in colonial America. As the community began to rebuild and reflect on the events of 1692 to 93, there was a growing recognition that the hysteria and fear that had driven the trials were misguided and unjustified. This newfound understanding helped to create a more nuanced and tolerant society, one that was better equipped to handle the complexities and challenges of the modern world. The Salem witch trials stand as a haunting reminder of the devastating consequences of mass hysteria, false accusations, and the dangers of unchecked power. This dark chapter in American history has left an indelible mark on our collective conscience, serving as a cautionary tale about the importance of upholding due process, protecting individual rights, and promoting critical thinking. The Salem witch trials may be a relic of the past, but their lessons remain urgently relevant today, inviting us to confront our own vulnerabilities and weaknesses and to strive for a more just, equitable, and humane world. Thank you for joining me throughout this historical journey. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, remember that, to understand the present, we must first understand the past.